back to my vlog here. Thank you all for tuning in. Today's video is going to be kind of about installing the ITBs on the Miata, because a lot of you have had questions for me. I kind of wrote them all down here to kind of put this all in a video to kind of give you guys clear explanation of what you need to do, especially if you have Mega Squirt and you want to do ITBs, because there's not a lot of information out there, and you have to know people in order to get your setup running properly. So I'm going to start with a few of them here. So what I've seen is a lot of people don't understand like the map sensor versus TPM or TPS sensor on here. So with ITB mode on the ITBs, what you have to do is you have to get some sort of map signal from the quote-unquote manifold, and you have to also get a throttle position sensor signal as well. What ITB mode does is it gets and tunes the vehicle based off of an alpha N, which would be your throttle position sensor, and it also tunes it on a map sensor based. But ITB mode kind of flips back and forth, so what you'll realize is once you turn on ITB mode in DIY Auto Tune Mega Squirt is it'll open up another set of tables called your switch point tables. Switch point tables is where that gets affected, but I'm not going to get into that just yet. How you need to get your map sensor signal here is, of course, you need to run vacuum lines from, say, like the back of the manifold here. So I have these drilled and tapped with vacuum lines on each one, and run over here to this vacuum manifold. So this vacuum manifold here gets basically all of my vacuum readings. So this red hose that runs from the vacuum manifold, yes, I know it's kind of janky, but it gets the job done for right now. I have a lot to do on this vehicle. Anyway, that runs all the way back to Mega Squirt. That's what gets my map sensor reading. Of course, I have another vacuum line here going to my fuel pressure regulator. And of course, throttle position sensor, I have the TPMS sensor here from Jenvey. It is their Jenvey, I think, 3-wire, which I tied into the factory wiring, which is how Mega Squirt's getting the throttle position sensor signal. Now, when you switch over to ITBs, of course, because this quote-unquote manifold is quite short, you don't get as well of vacuum readings when you're driving and you say have the throttle bodies closed and say you're coming down a hill. The throttle bodies, when they're closed, of course, will pull a good vacuum. With ITBs, it does not as much. So typically what you'll run into is that it's only pushing or pulling an average, at least at this elevation, of 50 to 70 kPa. Of course, my elevation is about 7,000 feet up here in Colorado, but that's what I get on this setup. So if you're at sea level, you may be closer to 70 to 90 kPa, or somewhere in that range for your vacuum readings. It's kind of a downside, which makes it very hard to tune, but that's where the ITB mode and the switch point tables come into play. So some other issues I've seen people run into with their ITB setup is, well, running into issues where they're quote-unquote having vacuum leaks. Vacuum leaks can be either because like your manifold here isn't tightened up against the manifold, or let's just say the ITBs aren't tightened up against the manifold that bolts to the head. So you can get vacuum leak here where these bolt up. You can get them from these little injector ports if you're not running them in the throttle bodies there. Or you can also get vacuum leaks, of course, from the injector ports if you plugged them on the head back there. Now, my biggest issue, what I had ran into, was the throttle linkage was sticking. So I had to add this spring here with this little bracket, and it's literally forcing them shut off of this. So since it's forcing it shut, it's not pulling enough vacuum to create a quote-unquote vacuum leak. So it'll idle right around an average of 1100 RPMs, which I'm perfectly fine with. So you have issues like that. Another big issue I see with people having is fluctuating idle and not balanced carbs. So when they test flow these on their bench, of course they put them on a bench. Of course they have them on a jig and a bench that can literally flow test them, that tries to balance the carbs themselves, which is fine because you want each hole to be the same size and be balanced properly. But when you put it on the car, it's a completely different story, because especially on a stock type motor, when you have hydraulic lifters, say one of those lifters is going bad, it's not going to be opening up the valve as much. So what you have to actually do is you have to balance each individual cylinder to the actual head, because each individual cylinder runner on the head is not going to flow equally. The idea with balancing the throttle bodies is to get a flow meter, which alright, so right here is your flow meter, and what you need to do is you put this into each individual runner, and you pretty much just see how much the engine air is pulling, and you try to balance them out. Now, of course, if your throttle bodies are completely closed and you're having issues with idling high, what you'll want to do is try to close each individual port, which on this, the ports you'll need to adjust are these little silver screws. Here, let me pull this tape off and stuff. Give you a better idea. Of course, that's stuck in there now. Whatever. All right, so like on this port here, you need to loosen this lock nut, and then there's this little, like, I think it's a 5mm Allen key. You'll tighten that down and it'll close the port a bit. And what happens there is it just limits the amount of air flowing through, because there's, of course, this little vacuum that needs to pull to keep the engine running when they're completely shut. So ideally, that's how you get idle issues down, because you need to check for vacuum leaks, ensure that you have proper vacuum, that you're pulling to the vacuum manifold and there's no leaks in that, and there's nothing else that can be leaking on it. So it's kind of a irritating and long process that you have to do to be able to diagnose these issues, of course. Other things you'll hear people say is that, well, these Jenvey pieces, these ITBs are, well, motorsports grade. That is 100% true. They're motorsports grade. When has building a race car ever been easy? Installing ITBs is one of the hardest things you'll ever figure out, because there's a lot more to it than just slapping them on and being able to drive it around. Of course, tuning has a big involvement in it, and that's also another thing I have to go over as well. But before we get into the tuning portion of it, what I'm also seeing other people run into is brakes. What are people doing for brakes? Because you don't have really a manifold as much anymore to be able to pull vacuum. You probably could. Heard people running like the vacuum for their brakes off of like the vacuum port and stuff like that. But what I personally did, which I think a lot of people will like, is I just ran a vacuum line over to basically a electric vacuum pump here. And this vacuum pump is from a 2012 CTS. I picked this up on eBay for, I don't know, $60 or something like that. And just put power and ground to it. Yes, I know I need to fix that too. Don't judge. But that's basically where I get my brakes. I mean, at this elevation, an engine can only pull about 16 inches in vacuum. This thing pulls about 24 inches of vacuum even at this elevation. It pulls pretty good vacuum, and that's how I've been getting my brakes. I just put power to it. It's kind of loud, but gets the job done quite well. Have not had any issues with braking. I mean, you'd think vacuum volume you'd need, but surprisingly it just pulling that amount of vacuum just gets the job done. I'm not sure how, but it does. Other things I've noticed is people asking about idle air control. I personally am not running any sort of idle air control on mine. I'm just letting it get up to operating temperature, wanting it to idle however it feels. There are ports, well, not necessarily ports, but there are little dimples in the bottom of the manifold that bolts to the head here that you can drill and tap. They give you actually these little, if the camera will focus, on these little things that you're supposed to drill and tap in. They're little ports you can hook up vacuum lines to run to an idle air control valve, and some people run it, some people don't. I mean, when my setup is cold, it'll idle around 1500 to 2000 RPMs, which is fine to me. And when it warms up, it'll idle around 1100. So, in my opinion, it technically has its own natural, like, idle air control without needing to add an aftermarket or make one up to fit it. What I've had other people ask me is the like total cost on my setup, and I'm like, I don't really know how to answer that. I mean, the ITBs themselves were 1900, but if you add up the cost of everything I've had to put into it, I'm not exactly sure. Because I mean, I had the Mega Squirt before, that was about $300. But that was from a long time ago. I had this thing tuned on Mega Squirt for like 6 years now. Getting the vacuum manifold, getting the fuel rail because the factory fuel rail won't work with it. Getting the vacuum pump. Just getting a bunch of little things here and there for it. The whole, I'd say, setup probably was right around $2,200, but if you guys are just trying to start from scratch and just ITB your car with a stock car, I would recommend to at least get a standalone ECU first. Get it tuned well on that, just running stock, because switching over to ITBs is just going to throw everything out of whack. And switching over to ITBs without having a good bass tune or anything like that is really going to hinder your setup. So take my word for it. Other things I've heard people ask me, which I personally don't have any experience with, is running other ITB setups, or like running carbs off of a motorcycle. And I know people have done it. I personally don't have any experience in it. I have only done this with the Jenvey setup. This will be my first time. Maybe I'll do more ITB setups, but other than that, I know people have done motorcycle throttle bodies. They've done other different ITB setups like the eBay one, but I personally have not dabbled in that, unfortunately. Alright, so other things, I'm personally running LS3 coils from a 2010-2013 Camaro SS. The LS3 coils are powered basically with well, the Mega Squirt, of course, but I have the MagnaCore wires running to them from Flying Miata, and those basically came as a set because Flying Miata has been using their LS3 coils, or actually GM's LS3 coils, for quite a long time, quite a few years, but I just bought that set of wires, so I can get proper fire into each cylinder, aside from running like the Flying Miata fuel rail, so I can get balanced injectors, but since it's a dual feed fuel rail, and of course it'll drain out through the fuel injector or fuel pressure regulator there. On to tuning a bit, I've noticed a lot of people, including myself, have had issues with the engine, especially on cold starts. You go to crank it over, crank. It'll idle for a little bit at like 400 RPMs. It'll die and it'll backfire through the throttle bodies. How I've been dialing that out, and what I think I've come to realize, is that the ITBs are kind of pulling more air than we think they are, because now it's not one throttle body feeding an intake runner to feed the entire engine. It's 4 individual throttle bodies, or just one individual throttle body feeding each cylinder, which obviously you guys know that, but what I'm saying is, because it's getting so much more air and volume, it needs quite a bit more fuel. And all I've done is increase my priming pulse table, my cranking pulse table, and my after start enrichment table. And I've seemed to kind of dial that out. The problem is I need to dial back my warm-up enrichment table. But those have all seemed to help it. Now I can get down to about 40, maybe 30 degrees before it does that shut off and backfire through the intake thing. And that's kind of what I'm seeing a lot of people having issues with, where it's just backfiring through the intake, even on hotter days and stuff like that, because they're just not getting enough fueling. Also, other things to check if you're backfiring through your intake is definitely check your ignition timing as well, just your fixed timing. Make sure, like on mine, make sure it's close to 0. You'll need a timing light, of course, and stuff like that, but definitely check your fixed timing before you mess with really anything on the tuning portion of it. I know my timing's good, definitely checked it, just to ensure, but yeah, definitely check that out just to be on the safe side, because that definitely could be an issue as well. And I've heard maybe a few people have issues with this as well, is they don't seem to be getting as much power. And what I've realized is, if you go into your ignition table was probably, depending on if you were at sea level or if you're at this elevation, your ignition table was probably advanced, say at, like if you're at sea level, you're at 100 kPa. And now it's dropped to 80 kPa or 85 kPa because it can't pull as much vacuum. So what's happening is, in your ignition table, since it's a map and RPM based, map portion of it is dropped to below where your typical ignition advancement is. So now, instead of, say, you're at 34 degrees of timing all the way across there, you're at 30. So that's, if you seem like you've lost power when you put ITBs on, definitely check out the ignition table. Also definitely check out your fuel table and ensure to lean it out, because I need to lean mine out a little bit, especially higher RPMs, and definitely with the warm-up enrichment. I've kind of gone through most of the issues that I've had some people mention to me about. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to add screenshots in here right after I'm done here with like my tuning map, the switch point tables I have currently set up, which still need to be adjusted, but maybe it can be a reference for you guys. My ignition table setup, and just kind of go over everything just so you guys can kind of see what my specific tune is. Also, just keep in mind that I am running on E85 or ethanol. So if you guys are running, say, 91, some sort of other pump gas, it's definitely going to be quite a big difference, because my table does need at least a 30% difference of fuel increase. So just keep that in mind. The other thing I'll mention here is that I'm running Megasquirt 2 specifically. guys do have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at all, either on Instagram or even on Facebook. If you have me on there, reach out to my email, which I'll put down here for you guys. Even comment down below in the comment section in this video. I mean, I'm definitely open to helping anyone get through this entire phase, and even if you guys have some tips and tricks for me, I'm definitely up to hear them, because I mean, this thing's not running perfect. It runs real well, but definitely not perfect. But I'll probably end this video here. Please like, subscribe, share, comment, and maybe this will help out you, a friend that's running ITBs. Maybe this can even help out other people running ITBs on different vehicles. But I hope you guys enjoy it. Thank you, and don't quit on a body that won't quit.